delighted to be at the Center for Fiction. I haven't read here before, but it's from what I've learned today, it's a wonderful institution, and nice to have a home for writers. I'm going to say a little bit about the book and then read a section and then say a few more things and read a little bit more. With a novel, I think it's better not to give too much of a preamble, because when I first started writing, with a background in nonfiction writing, when I first started writing fiction, I used to start every sentence, every paragraph with a topic sentence, which is great form for nonfiction, but it's fatal for fiction. And for the same reason, I don't want to tell you too much about the book before I start reading. I'd rather just you to try to get into the fictional world. But it's Mr. G is the story of creation as told by God. God is the narrator of the book. One of the things that motivated me to write the book, besides my love of magic realism and admiration for writers like Italo Calvino and Borges and Marquez and people like that, is that I think throughout history, we have, human beings have thought about what an infinite power might be, God, and always imagined from our point of view what God might be like. And I thought it would be interesting to look through the other end of the telescope and imagine that I am God, and what would intelligent life look like from that vantage if you were looking in the other direction. So that's sort of the impulse that started the book. So I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll tell you a few more things about the book, and then we can talk a little bit about that after that. As I remember, I had just woken up from a nap when I decided to create the universe. Not much was happening at that time. As a matter of fact, time didn't exist, nor space. When you looked out into the void, you were really looking at nothing more than your own thought. And if you tried to picture wind or stars or water, you could not give form or texture to your notions. Those things didn't exist. Smooth, rough, waxy, sharp, prickly, brittle, even qualities such as these lacked meaning. Practically everything slept in an infinite torpor of potentiality. I knew that I could make whatever I wanted, but that was the problem. Unlimited possibilities bring unlimited indecision. When I thought about this particular creation or that, uncertain about how each thing would turn out, I grew anxious and went back to sleep. But at a particular moment, I managed, if not exactly to sweep aside my doubts, at least to take a chance. Almost immediately, it seemed, my Aunt Penelope asked why I would want to do such a thing. Wasn't I comfortable with the emptiness just as it was? Yes, I said, of course, but you could mess things up, said my aunt. Leave him alone, said Uncle David. Uncle toddled over and stood beside me in his dear way. Please don't tell me what to do, retorted my aunt. Then she turned and stared hard at me. Her hair, uncombed and knotted as usual, drooped down to her bulky shoulders. Well, she said, and waited. I never liked it when Aunt Penelope glowered at me. I think I'm going to do it, I finally said. It was the first decision I'd made in eons of unmeasured existence, and it felt good to have decided something. In fact, I had just created time, but unintentionally. It was just that my resolution to act, to make things, to put an end to the unceasing absence of happenings, required time. By deciding to create something, I had pressed an arrow into the shapeless and unending void, an arrow that pointed in the direction of the future. Henceforth, there would be a before and an after, a continuing stream of successive events. Time necessarily came before light and dark, matter and energy, even space. Time was my first creation. See, my aunt complained when it became apparent that we were now conscious of time. I told you that you would mess things up. She shot Uncle a look of disapproval, as if he had encouraged me to act as I had. And then she began an unhappy summary of the various things that she had done and not done during the immediate past, then during the past before that, and so on, back and back through the now visible chasms of time, until Uncle begged her to stop. You should never have created the past and the future, she said. We were happy here. See, now I must say were, when before, oh, there it is again. It was nicer when everything happened at once. I can't stand to think about the future. But don't you think we have some obligation to the future? I said, some responsibility to all the things and beings I might create. Nonsense, shrieked Aunt Penelope. What a foolish argument. You have no responsibility to things that don't yet exist and won't ever exist if you could just keep your big thoughts to yourself. But it's too late now, she went on. I can feel time. I can feel the future. Aunt had gotten herself into one of her states, and the void twisted and throbbed with her displeasure. Gently, Uncle caressed her. For the first time ever, she responded to his touch. Her ranting diminished. Soon after, she realized that her hair needed combing, and that was the beginning of something, and probably all for the best. I had in mind a great number of things I wanted to make, but with no previous experience with materiality, I could think of these things only in terms of their functions or qualities. My ideas for both animate and inanimate invention required material existence, extension, volume, and for that I needed to create space. Space didn't appear all at once, but in a languorous progression, gradually increasing in length, width, and breadth. I had toyed with various numbers of dimensions. 2 seemed unnecessarily confining, in fact suffocating, while 4 or more struck me as extravagant and ran the risk of misplacing small objects. I decided my first try would be 3. As I recall, space first appeared in a minuscule round bubble that sat quietly in my mind. Then it stretched slightly in length, humming at a high pitch as it did so. For a time, the universe was a tiny ellipsoid. Slowly, breadth and width began to catch up with length, making an impatient clucking sound. Sphericity was restored. And then, with a sigh and a low rumble, all 3 dimensions began to unravel at once, tumbling and sprawling into the void. My universe had come into being. It was tiny at first, but beautiful, a lovely little sphere. Its surfaces were smooth and silky, yet infinitely strong. It glistened, it spun slightly, and it vibrated with energy. The tiny sphere that was the universe began inflating at an alarming speed. Aunt Penelope, who in a rare moment had been quietly brushing her hair, was knocked over by the expanding sphere. "Save me!" she screamed to Uncle Devil. over-dramatizing the situation as he often did. Uncle helped right her and steadied her. "What was that thing?" she shouted. "The impertinence." Then, without thanking Uncle, she stomped off into the void. Even though she had disappeared behind the folds and the pleats of the vacuum, I could hear my aunt muttering, "What's he done now? What's he done now? There's no end to this, no end. No end to this, no end. No end to this." Meanwhile, my universe was growing larger and larger. Once created, it seemed determined to become as fat as it could. I decided to make another. After a time, a gigantic number of universes were flying about, spinning on their axes, throbbing and pulsing, expanding and contracting at fantastic speed. My aunt was nowhere to be seen. Uncle Deva, as sympathetic as he was to my enterprise, had also ducked for cover. By and by, Aunt Penelope emerged from her hiding place, Uncle Deva from his. "You've been busy," said Uncle, looking with mild annoyance at the many universes flying about. "If I were you, I wouldn't get attached to any of them. You'll just be disappointed." I took Uncle's comment under advisement. Already, I was rather fond of some of the expanding spheres. "What's in those things anyway?" asked Aunt Penelope. "Space," I answered. She said. "Well, now that we have space, I'd like, please, a chair to sit down in. I've been standing for a very long time." So I made a chair for Aunt Penelope. That chair was my first creation of matter. It had 3 curved legs and an octagonal back, and I designed it to be comfortable, but not too comfortable. My aunt sat down in it without comment. Far more awaited. I wanted to make matter. I wanted to make galaxies and stars. I wanted to make planets. I wanted to make living creatures and minds. But for the moment, I sat and I meditated and I gazed with contentment at the empty but vibrating universes I'd made. Well, I wanted to say a few more words about the book before I read just a bit more. I wanted my version of God, Mr. G, to be a little bit different from the God portrayed in most religions of the world. So, unlike most deities in the world, and in the world's religions, when I say world, planet Earth actually plays no role in this novel. Earth is just one tiny speck among the billions of planets, among the billions of galaxies in the universe. So there's no reference to Earth or Homo sapiens at all. There is intelligent life that arises later on, but it's not earthly life. But I wanted my deity to be somewhat different than the usual portrayal of God. So my Mr. G is a humble and modest fellow. And he's all-powerful but not all-knowing. He doesn't always predict the consequences of his actions. And he learns by trial and error. He sometimes makes mistakes. But in order to bring out his character and flesh him out, I needed people for him to talk to. When I say people, I mean other beings inhabiting the void. And he's got his aunt and uncle. But I also introduce a Satan-like character who's originally just called the Stranger, but eventually we learned that he has a name, Belhor. And he, once intelligent life emerges in the universe, and the life forms have various ethical and moral dilemmas, Belhor and Mr. G debate the moral and philosophical implications of the difficulties that these intelligent beings get themselves into. That gives you a little bit idea of some of the future characters of the book. I do follow some of the intelligent life just a bit. So I'll continue reading now for just a few minutes, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Of course, there's a lot of time that goes by in this novel. Billions of years. I mean, it's the ultimate family saga. As you remember, in the part that I just read, Mr. G has created time and space. In the last sentence that I read was, "But for the moment I sat and I meditated and I gazed with contentment at the empty but vibrating universes I had made." I meditated, I did meditate, I am meditating, I will meditate. When I finally emerged from my meditations, a stranger was standing beside me, and beside him another creature, a fat and squat being whose countenance seemed frozen in a grin. In the unending expanse of existence, there had never been anyone other than myself, Aunt Penelope, and Uncle David. I was pleased to have another being to talk to, yet I was not accustomed to meeting things that I hadn't made myself. "Good day," said the stranger. If I may take the liberty of using that expression, it will come with future creations. "I haven't invited you here," I said. The stranger nodded, an acknowledgement of my comment, but without any apology. He was tall and thin, and he held himself both with ease and with a formality. "You have a congenial existence here," he said. "I've recently traveled through these regions, and they impart a definite tranquility. Not that I envy you, but you do have comfortable circumstances." "Too comfortable," said the grinning beast beside him. "Pardon, Baphomet," said the stranger, his gaze fastened on me. "He makes a good traveling companion." He paused. "But there is more serious questions I wanted to ask you. Do you think it is possible for a thing and its opposite both to be true?" I was startled by the stranger and his rude companion, but I found myself captivated by him and even mesmerized. I decided to answer his question. "A thing and its opposite cannot both be true in a rational system of thought," I replied, "but rational thoughts lead only to rational thoughts, whereas irrational thoughts lead new experiences," said the stranger. "Yes," I said. "My mind encompasses both the rational and the irrational." "Exactly," said the stranger. "I see that we can converse with each other." As we were talking, Baphomet, the sidekick of the stranger, was doing flips and somersaults, all the while watching us with his relentless grin. "Without knowing for sure," the stranger continued, "I would think that you are more fluent with the rational. But the irrational permits a greater exercise of, shall we say, power, if that is your aim." The stranger unfastened his gaze from me and stared out into the void. Then he turned sideways. He was so thin that he practically vanished, appearing as only a black line. "These universes you created," said the stranger, and he gestured at the quivering spheres and ellipsoids flying about. "Many of them will end in tragedy, or should I say, the animate matter you fill them with, the intelligent beings, will twist and suffer and meet unhappy ends. He smiled. I have no intention of that, I said. I wouldn't allow that to happen. I'm sorry if what I've said disturbs you, said the stranger. I command you into non-existence, I said. I'm afraid you cannot do that. As tall as he was, the stranger grew even taller, as if he had been crouching. The glittering multitudes, he said. So many little lives amounting to nothing. I ask you, what is infinity multiplied by 0? It's hardly worth our discussion. Give my regards to your uncle and aunt. The stranger bowed. Then he and his beast moved off through the void. May I give you some advice, nephew, said Aunt Penelope. The three of us had been wandering about in the void for some time, talking about how our existence had changed. Don't give him advice, said Uncle. He doesn't need our advice. Hush, said Aunt Penelope. I'm entitled to give advice to my nephew. Aunt Penelope took me aside, leaving Uncle by himself. Now I want you to listen to me, she said. This is no criticism. Your uncle and I have always been impressed with you. But we are your elders, and we do notice what goes on around here. You shouldn't do things with such haste. You rush into things. Slow down. Take your time with this project. I hadn't been aware I was rushing, I said to my aunt. All these things flying about, said Aunt. You made them so quickly. Why don't you concentrate on just one of your universes and see if you can do a good job with it? That's excellent advice, said Uncle Davo, standing some distance away. Which one would you like? I asked Aunt. It was not a serious question. There were quadrillions of spheres and hyperboloids flying about, by now having inflated trillions of times larger than where they were just a few moments ago. This one, said my aunt, and she suddenly reached up and caught one of the spheres flying past. Work on this one. We have confidence in you, your uncle and I, and we're certain you can do well with it. Now that you've started this project, just take your time. That's all I'm suggesting. Well, I've got one more scene to read you, but a lot of time passes between this point and the next scene. Mr. G creates galaxies and stars and planets, and eventually intelligent life arises. And in the meantime, he and his aunt and uncle make a number of visits to the new universe, maybe a few 100 million years between each visit, and they observe the rising intelligent life on various planets and what they're doing. So I'm going to skip over all of that and read you one more little bit. There were other things we in the void picked up from the new universe. Birthdays, for example. We thought birthdays were delightful. Aunt P and Uncle D began planning birthday parties for themselves, although choosing a date and an interval of time between birthdays was a bit problematic. Following one of our excursions into the new universe and back, Aunt P suddenly announced that she was having a birthday party after her next sleep, and she expected presents. And I don't want any items from the void made of nothingness, she quipped. I've got plenty of nothing. I want something material. Do you understand what I'm saying? Material. A birthday party is a splendid idea, said Uncle D, but about the presents, I don't know. No buts, said Aunt P. I'm going for my beauty rest now. When I wake up, I want presents, lots of them. You've got a whole universe full of stuff to choose from, and I want something pink. With that, Aunt P yawned and retired. A difficult spouse, Uncle whispered to me in exasperation. But what can you do? So Uncle and I went into the universe and found a newly forming galaxy full of pink stars, and we carried it back to the void. In the void, the material was nearly weightless. It shimmered and glowed. You could almost see through it. With a few folds and tucks, we made a beautiful dress for Aunt Penelope, as she'd always wanted. Uncle named the dress Kalyana. He said nothing about the mismatch of essences between the void and the material universe, as he had in mind a few material things he wanted for his birthday, which he informed me was coming up quite soon. "Oh my," Aunt P exclaimed when she woke up and saw the dress draped over an outcropping of the void. "It's lovely. You shouldn't have gone to the trouble." Immediately, she put on the garment. Then she studied herself for a few moments. She turned this way and that, exclaimed again, and began dancing about and singing at the same time. Although there were many pink stars, there were also blue and yellow and green ones. It was a dress of many colors. Wearing it, Aunt Penelope was the most beautiful thing in the void. Every time she twirled, a few stars came loose and began sailing off, and Uncle would shuffle over and scoop them up and stick them back on. For eons, Aunt P never took that dress off, even for sleeping. It lasted for 1 billion trillion atomic ticks. After that, most of the stars had exploded or burned out, and the garment lost its color and shape. Thank you.